Hello and welcome to Innovation Unlocked. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Will and Peter.
The cost to actually launch things into space is coming down dramatically.
We'll be hearing about, even if you're putting satellites into space, why you need IP rights and patents on Earth.
We're moving from a stage of sort of exploration of space that we had in the 60s and 70s, perhaps towards a commercialisation of space.
So this time I'm joined by my colleagues Peter and Will, and we will be discussing the space sector and particularly IP in the space sector. We'll be touching on topics such as how the space sector has experienced rapid growth, why IP is so important to the space sector, and in particular why early stage companies, not just early stage companies, but early stage companies, growing companies, in fact any company that's doing R&D should really think about an IP strategy and why that's important. Yeah. So first, Will, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Will. I'm a patent attorney at Mathys Squire. I've been here my whole career for 6 years. And before that, I had a background in sort of general engineering, but specifically sort of biomedical and computer vision type technologies.
Amazing. Thanks, Will. And Peter?
Yeah, so I'm Peter. I am also a patent attorney. I joined Mathys Squire 9 months ago. And before that, I was with another leading London firm for about 12 years. I have a background in physics and a PhD in medical imaging before I started in the profession.
Brilliant, perfect. And so you're both very well placed to sort of speak about IP in the space sector and patenting in that area in particular. So I think before we get into the specifics of sort of IP in space, I think maybe, let's chat a little bit about the scene, about the context, because, from what I'm seeing is that there's massive growth in the sector. There's lots of new entrants to the sector and lots of new players. Maybe, could you speak to that point a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, traditionally there have been very high barriers to entry to this sector. One of the main ones being the cost. But now we're starting to see that the cost to actually launch things into space is coming down dramatically. So I think in the space shuttle era, it was around $55,000 per kilo to launch. Now it's dropped to sort of under $3,000 or $2,000 per kilo.
Wow, that much?
Yeah,
that's
huge. So it's obviously a lot easier for people financially to actually put things into space, and that's a massive driving factor. Part of the reason for that has been because of new technologies that are enabling it. So with things like reusable rockets and sort of miniaturized satellites, these things are actually allowing people to bring down the cost, bring down that kind of bottom line, and make it a more commercially viable business.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I agree completely. I think we're moving from a stage of sort of exploration of space that we had in the 60s and 70s, perhaps towards a commercialization of space. That technology's enabled this, but there's a sort of drive to expand what we can do. And we're seeing it in things like resource extraction. You can imagine space mining as one of the contexts. We see companies talking about data centers being put into orbit. We talk about manufacturing in low gravity environments. And we can see space tourism even is something that's sort of in its nascent stage as well. And we can see that there are companies who are expanding in this sector. And so it feels like there are legal issues that need to be sort of considered.
So, I mean, I think, one of the companies, obviously the SpaceX, is Blue Origin, but, one of the other companies that I think many of us are aware of when you think about putting things into space is Starlink, the satellite internet company. And on the train in this morning, I saw, adverts for it there even, crazy. So I think, people might be aware of that, but I'm sure there's lots of other companies and early stage companies, new entrants that people aren't aware of. Maybe could you speak to, who do you think are the major players in the sector, and what kind of companies are they? What's their profile? Are they early stage? Are they,
One of the challenges that Will mentioned already is the cost of doing this is hugely capital intensive. And so the likelihood is that companies need to work with other companies in order to actually be able to achieve that. So you might work with SpaceX and use one of their Falcon rockets, but you're a company that is building a satellite that you want to put into orbit. And so there are going to be agreements in between companies that need careful consideration. And the kind of types of companies that are able to actually to expend the capital that is needed for a launch are going to be the huge companies. They're the ones who actually can afford to put a launch together and send it off into space. But there are going to be companies that need to work with them who are on smaller budgets and perhaps don't have the capital themselves to work solo. That they're going to be working with the household name companies like SpaceX.
Yeah, I mean, do you get a thing where do sort of people buy space or payload space in a big rocket, and then within that they then sell then a bit like sort of airline seats or something, and then
Exactly. So there's this sort of piggybacking idea where you have a larger company who's actually arranging the launch, and then they kind of sell off payload essentially to smaller companies. And I think that works quite well because like you said, another major barrier is regulation in this industry. So actually it's often these larger companies like SpaceX, like Blue Origin, who have the capacity to sort of tackle the regulation and then allow these smaller companies to piggyback on and join in.
Yeah.
I mean, and so something that at least I've seen from some of the work that I've done in the space sector is that it's not necessarily one company makes a satellite and they do all of that. It's actually a case of there's a company that maybe makes the propulsion mechanism, and then another company that does detection equipment. And as you say, so then they need to collaborate. And in my experience of IP, whenever there's collaborations, there's always IP issues. And perhaps that takes us on to sort of the next point. Why should companies consider IP protection when it comes to space? Why is IP so important for the space sector?
Yeah, so I mean, we'll mention the funding angle and the regulation angle already, but I think one of the crucial factors is that IP acts as really almost as a form of insurance in those circumstances. You can protect yourself from an unknown in the future. You don't know whether that agreement is going to work out. You don't know whether or not you might need protection for something else in the future. And obtaining some kind of IP protection can actually give you a sort of safety net in those circumstances.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, Andy, there's a huge amount of collaboration in this industry, and so having these sort of more concrete, hard, enforceable IP rights in place actually can give you more confidence to go out and sort of engage in these collaborations, talk to people about your technology without having to worry about, okay, is this going to be stolen by someone else, and I'll be left with no recourse for if that know-how and technology gets out there, compared to things like NDAs and trade secrets, for example, which have their place, but they are sort of a lot harder to enforce and don't have this sort of fallback option of being something that you can enforce.
Yeah, very, very, very correct there. Yeah.
I think one of the other things that IP gives you the opportunity to is to have a future bargaining position at a negotiating table. So if you find that someone else has gone after a patent for a particular thing and you find that you may be encroaching on their market, you may even be infringing their patent, having a patent portfolio of your own to look at and for them gives you a seat at the table. It gives you eventually a bargaining position that would enable you to, for example, cross-license, to agree some terms, to work with these, and almost to collaborate with someone who could otherwise be a competitor who otherwise might seek to keep you off the market.
So I've kind of got a double-headed question next. So, something that I've been asked before is, why should we're putting something in space? Patent rights are territorial. Do they cover space? Why should I get patent rights for something that's in space? Can we really enforce that? And then connected with that, really, what are other space-based industries doing? What are other companies that are working in space doing? Are they also filing patents?
Well, I think that the fundamental thing is everything that goes into space comes from Earth. So you can catch it at some point, whether it's at the point of manufacture or the point at which it's just before it's launched or when it's in transit. So even stuff that is sent into space, there are kind of earlier points in the supply chain that you can look at. And yeah, I mean, absolutely. We see sort of major space players with big patent portfolios protecting both the stuff that's on the ground and and the sort of some of the interaction with the technology once it's actually up in space.
Mm-hmm.
And you picked up on whether the sort of territorial aspect of patents actually extends to space, and that it's familiar that the Outer Space Treaty says basically that there's no sovereignty, the territory doesn't extend to space. But there is also the sort of a registration convention, which says that any space object, a satellite, a rocket, is registered to a particular country, and actually the United
like a ship or something.
like a ship, yeah. And the United Nations keeps a list of these, as in the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. You can look at the list of.
I did not know that existed.
You can look at the list of space objects that are registered to a particular country, and those are sort of international treaties, sort of public law, which governments have agreed with each other and agreed to abide by. But there is definitely a question of whether those laws actually also extend to patent law. Patent laws being private law because it gives you some private rights you can enforce against another individual or another company. It's not certain whether or not those, even having a registration is enough to have patent law extend to that particular territory. So I think what's actually happening as space is becoming commercialized is that we're realizing the law needs to develop in this area in order to catch up with the technical developments and to enable companies to have some kind of certainty. And in a sense, it's a certainty that has to be planned for ahead. You have to think about what the future changes could be, what they might look like, because it might well happen over the next 10 years, the next 20 years. So there are certainly some questions. You can plan for the future, and as I think I mentioned earlier, an insurance mechanism, just in case things turn out the way that's good for you or indeed not.
Yeah, and I think also kind of looking even further ahead, we've seen in the past a lot of important technology has come out of the space industry. So things like memory foam, scratch-resistant lenses, cell phone cameras, water purification techniques. So all of these were developed in the space sector and have then been brought into terrestrial markets. So actually, there might be these opportunities in other markets that if you have a patent for it, if you have some IP protection for it, that could provide real value in the future.
So I think that's a really useful and interesting point, actually, that maybe we could just kind of explore sort of for a minute or two. So how would you go about what protecting that, and what would the mechanism sort of look like to actually get most commercial value for that? So, say you're developing a technology, your primary application is for the space sector, but it could have uses elsewhere. If that company came to you as their patent attorney, what would your advice be? How would you, suggest they proceed?
Well, I mean, it's always hard to look into the crystal ball and kind of predict exactly how this might be used in other industries, but there are definitely ways that you can, even when it comes down to the details of the wording that you use in your patent application, that you can sort of make it clear that there are other possible uses for this stuff, particularly if you are inventing sort of smaller components that might quite easily be taken and put into other types of systems that aren't in space. I think having those potential uses in mind and kind of exploring that with the client, with your patent attorney, that's a kind of really useful exercise to do from the outset, because then if you've got that kind of in the bag, that might be quite useful later down the line.
And it also gives you the opportunity to consider the whole of your supply chain, the whole of your right from the very beginning, the component manufacturers, all the way through to assembly and putting it together, and whether that assembly takes place on Earth, or if it's partially assembled on Earth and it's in a particular state at launch, or whether its final assembly happens in orbit. So it's very much the case that you want to involve your patent attorney in those sorts of ideas right at the very outset if you can, because it's possible to draft applications to component parts that can be used in a variety of different circumstances. So yeah, it would be possible.
And so why are the patent rights so important? I mean, what value does it derive? Is it because you can then license those specific rights separately from others?
Well, licensing is one option, of course, but I mean, also the rights can be sold, or they're part of the intangible assets of a company that can be acquired. And they give you, I think I mentioned earlier on, they give you a bargaining position in that space.
So the patents, in reality, are really important, not just for protecting, what it is that you're doing and putting up into space, but actually potential downstream on-Earth uses in other fields.
Yeah, and even if you and your company are not the one who are going to be actually putting those into effect, it kind of at least provides an extra revenue stream in the future, where if you can license those rights to someone who is wanting to do that, it just sort of builds a stronger revenue model for your company.
Yeah. No, really, really interesting. Just going back to the point about sort of law and extending into space, am I right in thinking that in the US the law's a little bit different?
Yeah, that's definitely true. So the US is perhaps the one country that has specifically included a legislative provision that says our patent law extends to objects in outer space, provided they are registered with the US. The US is the state of registry. I mentioned the registration earlier on. And so US patent holders do have this opportunity to register their rights in the US, they register their satellite there, and they can extend protection beyond. But what's quite interesting is that builds in a kind of asymmetry with every other country at the moment, because other countries, it's uncertain whether or not the rights would extend. I mean, you could register your space object with the UK, but it's not known whether or not the law will extend to that point. And so you can end up in this almost maritime situation where you have this idea of a flag of convenience. You pick your state of registry depending on whether or not you want IP protection or you don't want IP protection. So if a country is slow to enact IP protections in space, then you might choose that to be your state of registry because then there's no patent rights to worry about. There's quite a lot of things that can arise as a result of this asymmetry, and the kinds of issues that would come with that will be familiar from things like maritime law.
Yeah, and I think until the system develops, there's just a huge amount of uncertainty about what it'll look like, and so kind of trying to build that into your IP strategy is important. Yeah.
So we touched on, Will, I think you mentioned earlier about all space-based objects, inventions, they come from Earth.
Yeah.
And so if, as a patent attorney, you're working with a space-based company, whether it's a startup, building their IP portfolio, or a more established company, and they come to you and say, like, well, we want you to help us protect this invention. I'm acutely aware, and I'm sure others are acutely aware that, it's very prohibitive to file everywhere in the world, right? Not only do some of the laws in some countries, there might be question marks as to how enforceable IP rights might be, but also just the cost.
Yeah.
So when you're sort of thinking about strategic protection and where to file, what would be the key consideration to think about? And
I think an important thing is what type of technology have you got? So if you have a mechanical type or sort of hardware product, it's unrealistic that you would be trying to catch that in space, that you'd be trying to catch a competitor using your technology once it's already in orbit. So really you want to be looking at, okay, where, can I catch it on the launch pad? Where are these things likely to be launched from? So, a lot of the European launches happen from French Guiana in South America, and then thinking, okay, well, which patent jurisdiction does that fall in? And as it happens, it falls within the European patent system. So just having this kind of awareness of actually where things are launched from, and then sort of going further back in the supply chain as well, saying, okay, where will they be assembled? Where will they be manufactured? And kind of targeting those countries, and also looking at, okay, where would our competitors want to do the same thing? Obviously, the number of countries can build up very quickly. So it's about sort of taking quite a efficient approach to this. I mean, we've seen in a lot of existing patent portfolios of some of the bigger players that the focus is at the moment on the US and Germany. The US, as we mentioned, is the only country to have this registration-based system for things that are already in orbit. Germany is where the European Space Agency's main data center is. So for kind of more software and communications-based inventions, you might be looking at where are the data centers and where are the kind of receivers on Earth.
And I guess on that point, when you are drafting patent claims to that kind of thing, you need to be very careful about the question of sort of divided infringement, right?
Exactly. So, in more conventional sort of telecoms or cloud computing based industries, you might think, some people might look to cover the whole system because it's accessible, it's all on Earth. But with sort of satellite communication systems, you've now got one or more nodes of your network or your system that are incredibly inaccessible. And so you actually need to think about, okay, let's focus on what happens on Earth, what things look like from the perspective of the data center on Earth. And then it just makes your life easier in terms of trying to catch infringers and stop people using your technology.
Your point about French Guiana, really interesting. I didn't know that about the EPA covering it. So that's
so European patents that designate France and unitary patents, they both include French Guiana.
That's really interesting.
And certain other French territories, I think.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess considerations are where you're going to launch it from, where your competitors are based, where it's likely to be manufactured, where you're operating, and then potentially also where investors are from, because we sort of touched on it very early on about sort of IP strategy and investment. Maybe could we just expand on that point a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, it gives an investors a chance to have an intangible asset that they can secure investment against, which is certainly something that companies who are seeking investment, and perhaps the smaller companies who are seeking investment rounds for their payload that's going to go onto a launch, need to think about. Often securing funding is quite a challenge, especially in the startup phase. And so having a patent application which protects both the space use and possibly even a future market that hasn't been talked about immediately is something that can be used as a negotiating point with an investor.
So what are the most common patented inventions in space?
The most common? I mean, we've seen components and we've seen various sort of data stream analysis, information coming down from satellites, being relayed to ground stations and those sorts of. I mean, common is perhaps a bit generous, but I mean those are the kinds of things we're seeing. So it does seem that some drafting is being done with this sort of issue in mind. It's already starting to take place.
Yeah, but I think the fact is that so much of the technology in the space sector is innovative, and so you actually see patents for such a range of things. Hardware, software, manufacturing processes, the sort of the whole lot really. So it's hard to pin down to one thing.
Amazing. So sort of to round things off, let me just think about how I'm going to express this, but if you're going to be working with an early stage company, for example, who's working in the space sector and they're quite skeptical about patent rights and why they should think about an IP strategy at all, what would be your key message to them? Why are IP rights so relevant to any business, in particular growing businesses in the space sector?
Well, for me, I think there are two key considerations. I think the first thing is you can control certain things, so you can control those. Look at the ground, which is where the law is a bit more certain, and focus on making sure that you have some kind of IP rights that work on the ground. And then I think, hopefully with your team of patents, certainly, you're going to have an awareness of the fact that this is a developing area of law, and that you need to consider what future position you might find yourself in, certainly with respect to your own technologies in space, and even if there are secondary markets outside of the space sector. You need to think about how you can have IP that can help you lever a position in that area.
And I think, as we've sort of touched on already, this is a booming industry, and therefore it's becoming increasingly commercial, and increasingly competitive. And actually having some IP protection helps you maintain that competitive edge, particularly when these other barriers such as funding and regulation are kind of starting to come down a bit, and the barrier to your competitors doing what you're doing is also coming down. So actually having this IP in place can kind of help you carve out your part of the market.
Yeah, it gives you that registered right that, you know, it protects against independent development of the same technology. I mean, it gives you quite a powerful position to be able to negotiate.
So what I'm hearing basically is, for any business working in the space sector, considering an IP strategy is really important. All your competitors are going to be doing it. If you're going to be working in the sector, you know, either going to be competing with them or collaborating with them. There's a lot of collaborations in the space sector. When there's collaborations, IP rights are so important to preserve your position. But also, you know, there's an investment angle, there's a funding angle as well. So an IP strategy really is critical for the space industry.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Peter, Will, thank you so much. It's been fantastic speaking with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.